the South. The man that stepped off the boat in Buenos Aires in 1871 was a minister of the Evangelical Church. His name was Johannes Dahlmann. By 1939, one of his grandsons, Juan Dahlmann, was secretary of a municipal library in Cala Cordoba and considered himself profoundly Argentine. His maternal grandfather had been Francisco Flores, of the 2nd Infantry of the Line, who died on the border of Buenos Aires from a spear wielded by the Indians under Catriel. In the contrary pulls from his two lineages, Juan Dahlmann, perhaps impelled by his Germanic blood, chose that of his romantic ancestor, or that of a romantic death. That slightly willful but never ostentatious Argentinianization drew sustenance from an old sword, a locket containing the daguerreotype of a bearded, inexpressive man, the joy and courage of certain melodies, the habit of certain verses in Martin Fierro, the passing years, a certain lack of spiritedness, and solitude. At the price of some self-denial, Dahlmann had managed to save the shell of a large country house in the south that had once belonged to the Flores family. One of the touchstones of his memory was the image of the eucalyptus trees and the long, pink-colored house that had once been scarlet. His work, and perhaps his indolence, held him in the city. Summer after summer, he contented himself with the abstract idea of possession and with the certainty that his house was waiting for him at a precise place on the flatlands. In late February 1939, something happened to him. Though blind to guilt, fate can be merciless with the slightest distractions. That afternoon, Dahlmann had come upon a copy, from which some pages were missing, of Weyl's Arabian Nights. Eager to examine his find, he did not wait for the elevator. He hurriedly took the stairs. Something in the dimness brushed his forehead. A bat? A bird? On the face of the woman who opened the door to him, he saw an expression of horror, and the hand he passed over his forehead came back red with blood. His brow had caught the edge of a recently painted casement window that somebody had forgotten to close. Dahlmann managed to sleep, but by the early hours of morning he was awake, and from that time on, the flavor of all things was monstrous to him. Fever wore him away, and illustrations from the Arabian Nights began to illuminate nightmares. Friends and members of his family would visit him and with exaggerated smiles tell him how well he looked. Dahlmann, in a kind of feeble stupor, would hear their words, and it would amaze him that they couldn't see he was in hell. 8 days passed, like 800 years. One afternoon, his usual physician appeared with a new man, and they drove Dahlmann to a sanatorium on Cala, Ecuador. He needed to have an X-ray. Sitting in the cab they had hired to drive them, Dahlmann reflected that he might, at last, in a room that was not his own, be able to sleep. He felt happy, he felt like talking, but the moment they arrived, his clothes were stripped from him, his head was shaved, he was strapped with metal bands to a table, he was blinded and dizzied with bright lights, his heart and lungs were listened to, and a man in a surgical mask stuck a needle in his arm. He awoke nauseated, bandaged, in a cell much like the bottom of a well, and in the days and nights that followed, he realized that until then he had been only somewhere on the outskirts of hell. Ice left but the slightest trace of coolness in his mouth. During these days, Dahlmann hated every inch of himself. He hated his identity, his bodily needs, his humiliation, the beard that prickled his face. He stoically suffered the treatments administered to him, which were quite painful, but when the surgeon told him he'd been on the verge of death from septicemia, Dahlmann, suddenly self-pitying, broke down and cried. The physical miseries, the unending anticipation of bad nights had not allowed him to think about anything as abstract as death. The next day, the surgeon told him he was coming right along, and that he'd soon be able to go out to the country house to convalesce. Incredibly, the promised day arrived. Reality is partial to symmetries and slight anachronisms. Dahlmann had come to the sanatorium in a cab, and it was a cab that took him to the station at Plaza Constitucion. The first cool breath of autumn, after the oppression of the summer, was like a natural symbol of his life brought back from fever and the brink of death. The city, at that 7 o'clock in the morning, had not lost that look of a ramshackle old house that cities take on at night. The streets were like long porches and corridors, the plazas like interior courtyards. After his long stay in the hospital, Dalman took it all in with delight and a touch of vertigo. A few seconds before his eyes registered them, he would recall the corners, the marquees, the modest variety of Buenos Aires. In the yellow light of the new day, it all came back to him. Everyone knows that the south begins on the other side of Avenida Rivadavia. Dalman had often said that that was no mere saying, that by crossing Rivadavia one entered an older and more stable world. From the cab, he sought among the new buildings the window barred with wrought iron, the door knocker, the arch of a doorway, the long entryway, the almost secret courtyard. In the grand hall of the station, he saw that he had 30 minutes before his train left. He suddenly remembered that there was a cafe on Cala Brasil, a few yards from Irigoyen's house, where there was a huge cat that would let people pet it, like some disdainful deity. He went in. There was the cat, asleep. He ordered a cup of coffee, slowly spooned sugar into it, tasted it, a pleasure that had been forbidden him in the clinic, and thought, while he stroked the cat's black fur, that this contact was illusory, that he and the cat were separated as though by a pane of glass, because man lives in time, in successiveness, while the magical animal lives in the present, in the eternity of the instant. The train, stretching along the next to last platform, was waiting. Dalman walked through the cars until he came to one that was almost empty. He lifted his bag onto the luggage rack. When the train pulled out, he opened his bag and, after a slight hesitation, took from it the first volume of the Arabian Nights. To travel with this book so closely linked to the history of his torment was an affirmation that the torment was past, and was a joyous, secret challenge to the frustrated forces of evil. On both sides of the train, the city unraveled into suburbs. That sight, and later the sight of lawns and large country homes, led Dalman to put aside his reading. The truth is, Dalman read very little. The lodestone mountain and the genie sworn to kill the man who released him from the bottle were, as anyone will admit, wondrous things, but not much more wondrous than this morning and the fact of being. Happiness distracted him from Scheherazade and her superfluous miracles. Dalman closed the book and allowed himself simply to live. Lunch, with bouillon served in bowls of shining metal, as in the now distant summers of his childhood, was another quiet, savored pleasure. Tomorrow I will wake up at my ranch, he thought, and it was as though he were two men at once. The man gliding along through the autumn day and the geography of his native land, and the other man, imprisoned in a sanatorium and subjected to methodological attentions. He saw unplastered brick houses, long and angular, infinitely watching the trains go by. He saw horsemen on the clod-strewn roads. He saw ditches and lakes and pastures. He saw long glowing clouds that seemed made of marble, and all these things were fortuitous, like some dream of the flat prairies. He also thought he recognized trees and crops that he couldn't have told one the name of. His direct knowledge of the country was considerably inferior to his nostalgic, literary knowledge. From time to time he nodded off, and in his dreams there was the rushing momentum of the train. Now the unbearable white sun of midday was the yellow sun that comes before nightfall and that soon would turn to red. The car was different now, too. It was not the same car that had pulled out of the station in Buenos Aires, the planes and the hours that penetrated and transfigured it. Outside, the moving shadow of the train stretched out toward the horizon. The elemental earth was not disturbed by settlements or any other signs of humanity. All was vast, but at the same time intimate and somehow secret. In all the immense countryside, there would sometimes be nothing but a bull. The solitude was perfect, if perhaps hostile, and Dalman almost suspected that he was traveling not only into the south, but into the past. From that fantastic conjecture, he was distracted by the conductor, who, seeing Dalman's ticket, informed him that the train would not be leaving him at the usual station, but at a different one, a little before it, that Dalman barely knew. The man added an explanation that Dalman didn't try to understand, didn't even listen to, because the mechanics of it didn't matter. The train came to its laborious halt in virtually the middle of the countryside. The station sat on the other side of the tracks, and was hardly more than a covered platform. They had no vehicle there, but the station master figured Dalman might be able to find one at a store he directed him to, 10 or 12 blocks away. Dalman accepted the walk as a small adventure. The sun had sunk below the horizon now, but one final splendor brought a glory to the living yet silent plains before they were blotted out by night. Less to keep from tiring himself than to make those things last, Dalman walked slowly, inhaling with grave happiness the smell of clover. The store had once been bright red, but the years had tempered its violent color to its advantage. There was something in its sorry architecture that reminded Dalman of a steel engraving, perhaps from an old edition of Paulette Virginie. There were several horses tied to the rail in front. Inside, Dalman thought he recognized the owner. Then he realized that he had been fooled by the man's resemblance to one of the employees at the sanatorium. When the man heard Dalman's story, he said he'd have the calash harnessed up. To add yet another event to that day, and to pass the time, Dalman decided to eat there in the country store. At one table, some rough-looking young men were noisily eating and drinking. At first, Dalman didn't pay much attention. On the floor, curled against the bar, lay an old man, as motionless as an object. The many years had worn him away and polished him, as a stone is worn smooth by running water or a saying is polished by generations of humankind. He was small, dark, and dried up, and he seemed to be outside time, in a sort of eternity. Dalman was warmed by the tightness of the man's hairband, the baize poncho he wore, his gaucho trousers, and the boots made out of the skin of a horse's leg, and he said to himself, recalling futile arguments with people from districts in the north, or from Entre Rios, that only in the south did gauchos like that exist anymore. Dalman made himself comfortable near the window. Little by little, darkness was enveloping the countryside, but the smells and sounds of the plains still floated in through the thick iron grate at the window. The storekeeper brought him sardines and then roast meat. Dalman washed them down with more than one glass of red wine. Idly, he savored the harsh bouquet of the wine and let his gaze wander over the store, which by now had turned a little sleepy. The kerosene lantern hung from one of the beams. There were 3 customers at the other table. 2 looked like laborers. The other, with coarse, Indian-like features, sat drinking with his wide-brimmed hat on. Dalman suddenly felt something lightly brush his face. Next to the tumbler of cloudy glass, on one of the stripes in the tablecloth, lay a little ball of wadded bread. That was all, but somebody had thrown it at him. The drinkers at the other table seemed unaware of his presence. Dalman, puzzled, decided that nothing had happened, and he opened the volume of the Arabian Nights, as though to block out reality. Another wad of bread hit him a few minutes later, and this time the laborers laughed. Dalman told himself he wasn't scared, but that it would be madness for him, a sick man, to be dragged by strangers into some chaotic bar fight. He made up his mind to leave. He was already on his feet when the storekeeper came over and urged him, his voice alarmed. "Signor Dalman, ignore those boys over there. They're just feeling their oats." Dalman did not find it strange that the storekeeper should know his name by now, but he sensed that the man's conciliatory words actually made the situation worse. Before, the men's provocation had been directed at an accidental face, almost at nobody. Now it was aimed at him, at his name, and the men at the other table would know that name. Dalman brushed the storekeeper aside, faced the laborers, and asked them what their problem was. The young thug with the Indian-looking face stood up, stumbling as he did so. At one pace from Dalman, he shouted insults at him as though he were far away. He was play-acting, exaggerating his drunkenness, and the exaggeration produced an impression both fierce and mocking. Amid curses and obscenities, the man threw a long knife into the air, followed it with his eyes, caught it, and challenged Dalman to fight. The storekeeper's voice shook as he objected that Dalman was unarmed. At that point, something unforeseeable happened. From out of a corner, the motionless old gaucho, in whom Dalman had seen a symbol of the South that belonged to him, tossed him a naked dagger. It came to rest at Dalman's feet. It was as though the South itself had decided that Dalman should accept the challenge. Dalman bent to pick up the dagger, and as he did, he sensed two things. First, that the virtually instinctive action committed him to fight, and second, that in his clumsy hand the weapon would serve less to defend him than to justify the other man's killing him. He had toyed with a knife now and then, as all men did, but his knowledge of knife fighting went no further than a vague recollection that thrusts should be aimed upward, and with the blade facing inward. They'd never have allowed this sort of thing to happen in the sanatorium, he thought. Enough stalling, the other man said. Let's go outside. They went outside, and while there was no hope in Dalman, there was no fear either. As he crossed the threshold, he felt that on that first night in the sanatorium, when they'd stuck that needle in him, dying in a knife fight under the open sky, grappling with his adversary, would have been a liberation, a joy, and a fiesta. He sensed that had he been able to choose or dream his death that night, this is the death he would have dreamed or chosen. Dalman firmly grips the knife, which he may have no idea how to manage, and steps out into the plains.